When it comes to drawing with ink, there are many different ways you can approach something like Inktober. Most frequently, it seems artists work in black and white, using hatching or stippling to imply shading, and often they use large areas of black simply filled in for darkness. But this is just one way of working through the challenge, and in broader terms, one way of working with ink in general. So I would like to go over 3 distinct ways that you can approach Inktober. I would like to start off by saying as well that these drawings are sped up by a factor of 2, so they're 2 times faster. Don't think that I am a drawing pro and I am capable of drawing this quickly, but it makes it a little bit easier as I'm showing the demonstrations. Let's start with outlines, sometimes also referred to as contour lines. This is perhaps the simplest looking way to approach ink drawing. Its simplicity often obscures how difficult it can be to get outlines exactly where you want them. Precision is difficult. This strategy is often served well by working with an undersketch first, like you can see here, and then inking over the top of that layer. For practical applications, this is a strategy I have used in the past prepping things to take into Photoshop or Procreate, taking them into a digital platform for coloring. In addition, this works really well if you're looking at making things like stickers. Just stylistically, it rather fits. The feel of this manner of drawing is quite different from some of the others, and the stark white space between the lines can be very iconic and attention-grabbing. Of course, you could always color something like this in too. There is nothing to say your drawings have to stay in black and white. The next strategy is hatching, and this is largely what I use. I tend to get my outlines at least loosely laid out, as in the prior strategy. Once I have that, I try to really think about the 3-dimensional forms of the objects that I'm drawing, the materials that they're made out of, and mirror that in the hatched marks I put on the page. For me, there is an almost meditative quality to this manner of drawing. As I start to work on the sphere and the triangular prism here, you can see not only am I using directional hatching, but I'm actually trying to apply some additional texture to the shapes and forms as I go about them. Now I'm going to give an example of what this might look like in a very simple ink drawing. I chose a small humanoid form, some cute little thing, gave myself a couple outlines, and immediately dove in with my ink. I'm putting the outlines together just to give me the rudimentary shape, and then very quickly, I'll start moving in with directional hatching in order to work out the shading and the 3-dimensionality of the form. In addition, the hatching allows me to communicate some of the subtle textures. In this case, as I work under the eyes, I'm illuminating the fact that there is a lack of illumination there, that there is shadow. That's exactly what I'm doing as I go around the bottom, as I work on the legs. I'm showing that the overall form is shadowing those things underneath. Now working on the top, I'm putting in some hatch marks that are basically trying to imply that this is something like hair, that it has a rhythmic structure to it. And as I go on to the face in general, I'm just going to give some textural implications. I'm going to imply that there is some manner of texture to this form. Maybe it's wooden, maybe it's stone. All we know is it's not 100% smooth. This is something that you run into on the prior strategy. All of those forms look 100% smooth. And that's not a problem. That might be exactly what you're trying to demonstrate. But hatching is probably my favorite of these strategies, the most enjoyable and meditative as I work through it. The next strategy is to use tones other than black and white. Revolutionary, I know. But for many people, the simple inclusion of grays can dramatically change your drawings. For many others, color is the reason that they make art. So do not feel like Inktober is not for you because it naturally excludes color. It does not have to. In fact, a lot of my favorite drawings that I have seen and some that I have made have involved color, even for Inktober. As I start on the sphere and the cylinder, I'm giving myself those same pencil outlines and then immediately going into a light gray. This would be a good strategy if you're only going to keep things in grayscale. You don't actually want to use any full spectrum color. Now, they look a little strange right now because in general, if I was doing this, I would create all of my ink lines and then fill them in. But because I'm trying to do this in a swift manner, I'm doing the ink over the top. You can see now even those simple lines start to fill out those forms and make them a little bit more understandable and believable. As I go into my final example here for the color and shading, I am actually going to make the ink drawing first, and then I'll subtly go in and mess with the colors. So if you notice a little bit of bleed, that's only because I wasn't patient enough here in the recording process. If you were going to do this, I would highly recommend you lay down your ink lines and then you come back to it later. So I'm creating a rather simple character. I'm going to give myself some outlines very much akin to that first strategy. And if you are approaching Inktober for the first time, this would be a fine place to leave things. But I think that color is a really lovely and enjoyable potential addition to your work. So let's see what happens when I start to throw some color on here with my brush pens. This very simple drawing is quickly going to turn into something a little bit more interesting. I'm filling in areas of color right now, not worrying too much about shading, just thinking about, well, if the whole hat's brown, then the underside would have to be darker. That makes sense. Although I do think, yep, I make one line on the side to imply that, okay, light's coming from the left side. This is something that's really important regardless of the strategy that you're using. Think about where light is coming from. On each of the spheres, even the cylinder and the prism, I'm thinking about where light is coming from. That tells me where to put the shading, where to put the hatching. On the first example, it simply tells me where to put the cast shadow. It's a very important thing to understand and to be aware of. Unless, of course, you're using no shading, but I would recommend that you try to use some because it does make everything just feel a little bit more realistic and it makes it more interesting to look at. So I'm continuing to lay down the colors here. I haven't thought about this character ahead of time. It does reference something that I drew earlier today, but that was, again, just a random thing I put together. So it has no significance. The colors don't mean anything. I'm just randomly applying them. I did think of it as being kind of a raven. That's why we've got the darker tones, and a lot of birds have orange or yellow legs that are kind of scaled. So I'm throwing these things on here. As I'm finishing up just the first layer of color, though, I'm immediately going to turn back to shading, to thinking about light. Where is light coming from? This is going to mean that I'm going to start throwing darker tones underneath things, darker tones on the right side of the character, as I've established that light is coming from the left. Speaking of shadows, I apologize for the shadow that my hand is casting on this drawing, if that makes it a little bit more difficult to see things. But you can see in a strategy like this, it's very, very different. And if this is more your cup of tea, you like using color, I would strongly encourage you, don't limit yourself because most people seem to use just black and white for Inktober. I am not going to use color this round, but that's because I'm going to either watercolor them later or digitally color them. So you're only seeing a piece of the puzzle. While this is certainly not an exhaustive list of all the ink techniques that you can employ, you could easily use black and white watercolor, you could use ink with a brush, you could use a dip pen, you could use brush pens, which I will be using but haven't illustrated here. There are so many additional options. But I just wanted to take a couple minutes and show off 3 that are pretty easy to wrap your head around, 3 that might make it just a little bit more accessible for you, and 3 that might get you into Inktober this year. I hope this has been helpful for you. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.